Hi, I'm Andrew Torrez, and this is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 47 of the Naked Mormonism podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is Thursday, February 2nd, 2017. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. We have a lot to get to today, so let's do a quick roundup of the last historical episode. The main focus of the last historical timeline episode was this refugee crisis that was absolutely crushing Joe and the church leadership. So Joe, his brother Hiram, and Sidney Rigdon had successfully intermingled church and state authority in the Mormon stronghold cities of Far West and Diahman, Far West being in Caldwell County, Diahman being in Daviess County. But it also meant that anything bad happening to the Mormons could be blamed on nobody other than Joe and the Mo posse, right? I mean, if they're responsible for everything good, they are also responsible for all of the negative things that are befalling the poor Mormons here. But in order to fix this starving refugee problem, Joe went with the only option that he could see and became, as he said himself, quote, a second Muhammad to this generation, end quote, sending out multiple parties of armed men on horseback to conquer the villages in Daviess County. And they did. You know, each military commander in the army of Israel, or the Danites, made their way through Millport and Gallatin and the smaller surrounding villages, and they stole every possession they came across and chased out every non-Mormon from their home and herded every single head of cattle back to the bishop's storehouse in Diahman. The starvation would no longer be a problem, but this amped up the military violence and gave the local state militia generals license to take serious measures against the Mormons once they realized that the Mormons were done being fucked with, and that they would go to any measure to solidify their own survival. But Governor Lilburn Boggs, he was in the mix of all of this as well, and we can point to his apathy and his active disconnectedness as one of the major escalating factors when it came to violence between the Mormons and Missourians. This Mormon conquest, wherein they committed the Mormon depredations, changed the Mormons' status from provocateur and victim to inciter of violence. But while these warring groups of leaders were at a steady disagreement, it was the everyday people who were caught up in the chaos who were affected the most, which is why we read a large excerpt from Benjamin F. Johnson's autobiography last episode. But, and we're going to continue relying heavily on these first-person accounts to get us through the end of 1838, because they're very important and very abundant, trust me. All right, so that's enough for the milk of the episode. Let's jump into the meat and really get started here. Before talking about the aftermath of the Mormon conquest of Daviess County, we need to be properly introduced to a few important people for this episode. Now, our first introduction is to a colonel by the name of Cornelius Neil Gilliam. And he went by Neil Gilliam, from what I can tell. But this guy is actually pretty important to American history in the broader sense. But for our purposes, we need to understand him with a simplistic label of a hateful anti-Mormon vigilante. All right, his Wikipedia page has him born in North Carolina, April 13th, 1798, where he fought in the Black Hawk and Seminole Wars, or genocides, depending on how you view colonialist and native relations after the Indian Removal Act was signed, but that's a separate issue. But after that, Gilliam settled in Missouri a few years before the Mormons began moving there en masse at the command of their young prophet in 1831. So Colonel Gilliam was an active military buff his entire life. After the Missouri anti-Mormons came out on top of the 1838 Mormon War here, Colonel Gilliam was elected to the Missouri State Senate before moving out to the chaotic frontier of the Oregon Territory in 1844, the year that Joseph was shot. He fought with the Cayuse natives out there, I think that's how you say that, and then in honor of his patriotism and military prowess, Gilliam County, Oregon, and the World War II merchant ship Cornelius Gilliam were both named in his honor. Now, while I can't find any physical descriptions of the man, he was clearly, kind of a rough and tough, doesn't take shit from any kind of person, mountain man. But, he's probably brash and unabashed and had no problem telling the Mormons exactly what he planned on doing to them. He was a leader of several small militia forces who made their presence known during the siege of DeWitt and later at Diahman. Now, Colonel Gilliam has been mentioned once or twice before since we started studying this time, but it's finally to actually give him a proper introduction to hear where Colonel Cornelius Neal Gilliam came from. So let's get another introduction here. So that Colonel Gilliam, that was our first introduction. Let's do another hostile anti-Mormon. Now, pro-Mormon and anti-Mormon are simplistic labels for this entire conflict, but they serve the purposes of labeling these people so we know which side of the conflict they fall upon, which is important to understand the broader sense of the conflict. So this next hostile anti-Mormon vigilante we're going to talk about is a man named Captain Samuel Bogart. Now, this is from his Wikipedia page. He was born April 2nd, 1797, was an itinerant Methodist minister, a War of 1812 veteran, and a militia captain from Ray County, Missouri, who played a prominent role in the 1838 Mormon-Missouri War before later moving to Collin County, Texas, where he became a Texas Ranger and a member of the Texas State Legislature. He is best remembered, however, for his role in leading opposition to Mormon settlers in northwestern Missouri, and for the active role he took in operations against them in the fall of 1838. These operations led to the expulsion of nearly all Mormons from the state, following the issuance of Governor Lilburn Boggs' infamous extermination order in October of that year. End quote. All right, so that was his Wikipedia page. Check the show notes for that. But Captain Samuel Bogart had been living in Ray County since 1833, when the Mormons were first expelled from the neighboring Jackson County. Now, Bogart had had extensive relations with the Mormons, usually in leading mobs against them or assisting in forcibly removing them from their homes in DeWitt and the outlying areas in Carroll County. So, we're kind of getting an overall idea of who this Captain Samuel Bogart person is. But, of course, as I said, go to his Wikipedia page. There's a picture of him from 1860 where you can just picture a long-haired David Cross with like a two-toned Hitler stash. And that does it for you. But the next and final introduction we have for today is a man named General John Bullock Clark. Okay, so we have three proper introductions at the beginning of the episode today. First was Colonel Neal Gilliam. Second, Captain Samuel Bogart. Third is General John Clark. He was born in Kentucky, April 17th, 1802, where he studied law and passed the bar in 1824, after which he established his own law practice in Fayette, Missouri. He was a colonel during the Black Hawk War of 1832, exuding his military prowess. And soon after, he'd be involved in the Missouri Mormon conflict. He served as second in command only to General Atchison until Atchison was relieved of his command, which we'll get to fairly soon here. But obviously, living in Missouri during the entire Mormon conflict spanning from 1833 to 1838, General Clark was no stranger to the Mormons and the trouble their presence had caused. He was living in Howard County. That was just a few miles downriver from DeWitt in Carroll County, before it was taken over by Clark's friend from Howard County, Colonel Congreve Jackson, who chased the Mormons out of DeWitt. Now, General Clark didn't like the Mormons, as he'd been a settler of Missouri long before they'd arrived and began driving land prices down. He simply didn't like the Mormons. I'm not basing that off of any specific quotes we have from him, because he was much more pragmatic about the things that he left on record, but just based off of his actions against the Mormons alone, we can come to a conclusion that he wasn't terribly friendly. When it comes to Colonel Neil Gilliam or Samuel Bogart, we have quotes from them claiming that they'll kill all the damned Mormons because it was the law, but General Clark never said anything that directly inflammatory against them. He was a much more intelligent military commander. And maybe that's why he was general instead of a colonel or a captain, right? I mean, he was better at not letting his personal frustrations affect his military leadership, at least on the surface of things. You know, who knows? If you want to know what General Clark looked like, go to his Wikipedia page. It's in the show notes. Or just picture a guy yelling at a teenage Jack Black right before ripping his AC/DC poster off the wall. You'll know exactly what General Clark looks like. So Clark will become very important near the end of this episode. But for now, Colonel Gilliam and Captain Bogart are the main focus of our historical discussion today. Now, I have to draw a distinction between General Clark and General Parks, okay? I believe it was two historical episodes ago, we discussed a letter exchange between General Parks and a faithful Mormon in trying to get his gun back after the surrender. General Parks was friendly to the Mormons, as was General Atchison and General Donovan. Those three generals were basically the only generals that were friendly to the Mormons. But that was General Parks. General Clark was an anti-Mormon. He did not like the Mormons, and he had been a military presence during this entire conflict. We need to keep those generals separated. We have General Clark, anti-Mormon, General Parks, pro-Mormon. As I said, they're simplistic labels, but they serve our purposes for today. Anyway, let's start with talking about Colonel Neil Gilliam, okay? When he heard about the Mormons just berserking through Daviess County and committing their depredations, he called upon his local town militia, which is at this point just a fancy word for his fellow Mormon-hating friends in Clinton County. So let's be clear. Colonel Gilliam didn't have legal sanction for this militia. They were just a violent vigilante mob raised in answer to what were coming to be known as the Mormon depredations. This is a passage from the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri by Stephen LeSueur about Colonel Neil Gilliam's mob, and this is on page 129. Quote, Gilliam later cited the Mormon depredations in Daviess County as the reason why he called out his regiment. Quoting Gilliam now, I saw enough to make any man who had a spark of love for his country or sympathy for insulted humanity to take up arms and fight to redress their wrongs. End quote. Going back to Stephen LeSueur, quote, he said, Gilliam's family tradition also had it that his relatives were among those burned out by the Mormons. If so, he now returned the favor. Over 200 men flocked to Gilliam's camp, where they painted themselves with red and black stripes, Indian style, to distinguish themselves from the Mormons. It's so racist. Gilliam called himself the Delaware Chief. Oh, this is horrible. And proposed to his men that the conflict be decided by single combat between the Mormons' champion, General Lyman White, and himself. The painted soldiers, whooping and yelling like ferocious savages, horribly racist, marched through Clinton and Daviess County, driving Mormon settlers from their homes, plundering and burning. As the men advanced into Caldwell, they talked of driving the Mormons to Far West and then out of the state. End quote. Well, all right, let's just take a second there. These men weren't gathering with any sensibility or plan. They were just getting together, probably drinking a shitload, and then dressing up like natives and proclaiming that Colonel Gilliam should take on General Lyman White in one-on-one hand-to-hand combat. to decide the outcome of this conflict, and they did this all before they began rioting and ransacking the Mormons that they could find in Clinton and Daviess counties, encroaching on Diahman. So, I mean, to illustrate that they were simply just a rogue vigilante group, General Donovan, the friend of the Mormons who'd been helping them for quite some time, General Donovan was one of the good guys for the Mormons. He was the commanding officer over Colonel Gilliam, but when Gilliam's 200 men gathered, General Donovan remained in his home just out of ignorance of the whole ordeal. When an officer like Colonel Gilliam gathers 200 men together, if he were doing that under the sanction of his own commanding officer, General Donovan would have known about it. He would have been there as well, or he would have been commanding it to be done, but there's simply no evidence to suggest that Gilliam was acting by any other means than just vigilantism. So Gilliam, along with a number of other militia commanders, including Captain Bogart, were gathering their troops without state sanction to answer these Mormon depredation. It wasn't just Gilliam who was doing this. I have to point this out. These were very small acts of mutiny that were slowly rolling over the entire region. But we have to understand that enough people were frustrated with the Mormons that they refused to listen to their commanding officers when those officers refused to march against the Mormons, as had General Donovan, Atchison, and Parks. So these men committed some kind of passive mutiny by gathering these armies without any orders. These are vigilante mobs. So General Parks, Donovan, and Atchison were all being heavily criticized by other militia commanders, as well as the general anti-Mormon media for siding with the religious fanatics. So people began to suspect that Donovan, Parks, and Atchison were siding with the Mormons just to pander for future votes. It was all a political game to them. Which, that's a fairly reasonable accusation. Some people were even implying that there was monetary collusion between the parties. They were saying the church leadership was just paying off these generals to be on their side. Given some things that had happened in the past, though, it's not hard to come to any of these conclusions. I mean, put yourself there. Get into the mind of some of the people that were there, of a typical anti-Mormon vigilante mob member here. Picture yourself in the mob that surrounded Diahman after the Mormons raided and stole those 45 guns. Remember that? That was a couple episodes ago. Bogart's troops were camped out laying siege. They were preparing an attack the next morning on Diahman when General Donovan marched his men 36 miles in one day and camped out in between Bogart's troops and Diahman to quell the arising conflict. Then Atchison arrived the following day just to solidify law and order to keep the conflict from arising. And then, given what happened after that conflict, it ended with the vigilantes giving up their post outside Diahman and the Mormons completely taking over Daviess County, driving the non-Mormons from their homes. Now, if you're a member of Bogart's vigilantes, Donovan and Atchison just stopped you from killing some of the damned Mormon fanatics, forced your surrender of the siege, and negotiated removal of all of the non-Mormons from Daviess County. That's a complete and total loss in the eyes of the justice-seeking anti-Mormon vigilantes. In this situation, if you're a Missourian that just hates the Mormons for whatever reason, it sure seems like Donovan and Atchison were siding with the Mormons to the detriment of the Missouri natives. Now, it's hard to understand it from, the anti-Mormon perspective, but hopefully this sheds a little bit of light onto the situation and why Colonel Gilliam and Captain Bogart and other military commanders were gathering together their armies without state sanction, without the knowledge of their commanding officers. These men were gathering their militias to respond to the Mormon depredations. And in my opinion, I think that these actions are considered passively mutinous. They did so in defiance of orders, or at least without any specific order from any senior ranking commanding general. And this wasn't the first or nearly the last time that mutiny by the vigilantes culminated in situations getting worse for the Mormons. Mormons in all the surrounding counties, Clinton, Ray, Clay, Livingston, Daviess, Carroll, especially Caldwell, where Far West was, were being harassed and chased from their homes. The various mobs were beginning to collapse upon the two sanctuary cities by consolidating the Mormon population to Daviess and Caldwell counties, where Far West and Diahman provided little respite to the thousands of refugees. Now, a small number of the people experiencing this violence were writing to anybody they could contact who may be able to help. Now, Governor Lilburn Boggs began to be flooded with more reports from both Mormons and anti-Mormons claiming that they were being forcibly removed from their homes by armed mobs. Completely true claims. This is a letter written by General David R. Atrocity, of course, a noble man and a good friend of Joe and the Mormons. You can almost sense the defeatist tone in his letter. It's heartbreaking. It almost offers this insight into the conflict and it forces us to empathize with the frustration that Atrocity had at Boggs for not taking proper actions to stop this problem before it turned into an all-out war. General Atrocity sent this to Governor Lilburn Boggs right before he was relieved of his field command by Boggs. There may be a cause and effect factor there, but I'm not sure. This is taken from a PDF of the Mormon War Papers on the Missouri State Archives. There's a link for it in the show notes. Quote, Liberty, October 22nd, 1838. To His Excellency, the Commander-in-Chief, Sir. Almost every hour I receive information of outrage and violence, of burning and plundering in the county of Daviess. It seems that the Mormons have become desperate and act like madmen. They have burned a store in Gallatin. They have burnt Millport. They have, it is said, plundered several houses and have taken away the arms from diverse citizens of that county. A cannon that was employed in the siege of DeWitt in Carroll County and taken for a like purpose to Daviess County has fallen into the hands of the Mormons. It is also reported that the anti-Mormons have, when opportunity offered, disarmed the Mormons and burned several of their houses. The great difficulty in setting this matter seems to be in not being able to identify the offenders. I am convinced that nothing short of driving the Mormons from Daviess County will satisfy the party opposed to them, and this I have not the power to do as I conceive legally. There are no troops at this time in Daviess County, nor do I deem it expedient to send any there, for I am well convinced that it would but make matters worse. For, sir, I do not feel disposed to disgrace myself, or permit the troops under my command to disgrace the state and themselves by acting the part of a mob. If the Mormons are to be drove from their homes, let it be done without any color of law and in open defiance thereof. Let it be done by volunteers acting upon their own responsibilities. However, I deem it my duty to submit these matters to the Commander-in-Chief and will conclude by saying, it will be my greatest pleasure to execute any order your Excellency should think proper to give me in this matter with promptness and to the very letter. I have the honor to be your Excellency's most obedient servant, David R. Atrocity, Major General. I hereby enclose to you a report from General Parks and also from Captain Bogart. Signed, David R. Atrocity. End quote. Seriously, from that, doesn't it just sound like Atrocity was at a complete loss of what to do here? Just petitioning Boggs, saying that people are raiding each other's homes. They are, Mormons are disarming anti-Mormons. Anti-Mormons are chasing Mormons out of their homes. They're doing these things to and from each other. Calling out more people isn't going to solve the problem. We don't need any more troops. Now, I didn't list it specifically in this letter, but of many other times, Atrocity called for Boggs to make a personal appearance, saying that a word from your Excellency would do more to quell the insurrection than any number of troops would. I mean, Atchison, it feels like he's just so overwhelmed here and doesn't know what to do, and is asking Boggs to just be smart about what's going on here, and also saying, I'm going to do whatever you ask me to do. It'll be my greatest pleasure to execute any order you should think proper to give in the matter. But I don't think he realized that the next thing issued from Boggs's office would be the extermination order. But, there's a fair amount of disagreement about whether General Atchison willingly left after receiving Boggs' response to his letters, or if he was actually actively removed by Boggs. But given the tone of this letter, doesn't it just sound like Atchison threw his hands up in the air and just said, I'm done? He says it specifically, quote, I do not feel disposed to disgrace myself or permit the troops under my command to disgrace the state and themselves by acting the part of the mob. They're acting as vigilantes. And the most important part, the most important line in this entire letter is, if the Mormons are to be drove from their homes, let it be done without any color of law and in open defiance thereof. Let it be done by volunteers acting upon their own responsibilities. Vigilantes. Yeah, that's powerful stuff. And I think it speaks volumes to Atchison's character. It wasn't a popular pick to be friendly to the Mormons, and obviously Atchison, Donovan, and Parks were all feeling the wrath of their pro-Mormon sympathies. From this time, from when this letter was written on the 22nd of October until the 27th, the commanding officer in the field would be General Lucas, as opposed to General Atchison. And then Boggs ended up making General John B. Clark, who was our third introduced person today, the commanding field officer over the entire northern state militia. Now, there's a lot of names and a lot of people to try and keep straight here, so I'm trying to be as simple as I can in this. I need like a huge graph to show this all to you guys, but this is an audio medium. We're doing the best we can here. But we do need to talk about our second introductee for today. This was Captain Samuel Bogart. So let's kind of catch up with what was going on with him. Here's a brief description of his part over the past couple of weeks we've been discussing from a man by the name of Peter H. Burnett. And this is taken from his autobiography, Recollections and Opinions of an Old Pioneer, page 57 through 58. Now, a link for a PDF of this book on archive.org will be in the show notes. Please read his recollections. They're really fascinating about this time. Quote, when the election came on, the men of Daviess County made an effort to prevent the Mormons from voting at that precinct. A fight ensued, that's a Gallatin Day election, in which the Mormons had the best of it. Other difficulties followed until Lyman White, at the head of the Mormon forces, invaded Daviess County, most of which he overran, driving all before him. That's talking about the Mormon depredations. General D.R. Atchison, then commanding the militia in that part of the state, ordered Captain Bogart of Ray County to call out his militia company and occupy a position on or near the county line between Ray and Caldwell, and preserve the peace between the people of the two counties. But Captain Bogart was not a very discreet man, and his men were of much the same character. Instead of confining himself and his men within the limits of his own county, he marched one day into the edge of Caldwell and was not only rather rude to the Mormons residing there, but arrested one or two of them, whom he detained for some little time. Information of this proceeding was conveyed to Far West that same evening, and Smith at once ordered Captain Patton with his Danite band to march that night and attack Bogart. End quote. All right, so that's one first-hand account here. Let's sum up what just happened by reading it from the Comprehensive History of the Church by B.H. Roberts. And I'm reading this from page 474 of Volume 1 of my 1930 publication of the Comprehensive History. And, thank you, Grandma, for this. Quote, on the evening of the 24th of October, word was brought into Far West of the operation of Captain Bogart's command in the south part of Caldwell County. Bogart saying that he had expected to give Far West hell, that's a quote, before noon of the following day, provided he joined forces with Neil Gilliam, who had raised men from Platte and Clinton counties, west of Clay and Caldwell respectively, to march against the Mormons, and who would camp within 6 miles of Far West that night, while Bogart himself would go into camp on Crooked River. The same day, a detachment of Bogart's men entered the house of a brother Pinkham, took 3 men prisoners, also took 4 horses, some firearms, and food, and warned Pinkham to leave the state at once, or they would have his damned old scalp. That's another quote. These reports were brought into Far West about midnight, and Judge Elias Higbee immediately called upon Colonel George M. Hinkle to raise a company of militia to disperse the mob and rescue the prisoners. This was done and the command given to Captain David W. Patton, who at once marched upon Bogart's encampment on the 25th. End quote. All right. Bogart had set up camp on Crooked River. This was a strategically advantageous position, as would be expected from a War of 1812 veteran, right? And while his contingency of 40 to 60 men set up camp, a small band of them went sweeping, or scouting, I guess, the nearby area looking for Mormon spies who might learn of their position. And upon their scouting troop, they forcibly entered the home of one Nathan Pinkham, who was a non-Mormon, harboring 2 Mormon spies, named William Seeley and Addison Green. Now, Bogart's men took the 2 spies prisoner, as well as Nathan Pinkham's son, Nathan Jr., and, as B.H. Roberts wrote, told Pinkham to be out of his home within 24 hours, chasing him out. Now, Pinkham wasn't a Mormon, he was just a friendly non-Mormon. Now, word of these spies being taken prisoner got to Joe and the leadership in Far West around midnight, and Joe immediately told David Patton, also known as Captain Fearnought, to get the Danites down to Crooked River and liberate those prisoners ASAP. And he did. Captain David Patton gathered up his contingency of 80 men, the Destruction Company, and they made their march towards the border of Ray and Caldwell counties, where Crooked River and Captain Bogart's men lie. I'm going to read another excerpt from the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri by Stephen LeSueur, page 138 to 139. Quote, Mormon leaders quickly decided to raise a company of men to rescue the prisoners and disperse the Missouri troops. Quote, go and kill every devil of them, end quote, the outraged Mormon prophet reportedly advised. The sound of the bugle and the beating of drums summoned the brethren to the public square. Known as Captain Fearnought among his soldiers, Patton had gained a reputation as a skilled and fearless leader. Reportedly a captain of the Danite organization, Patton had led Mormon troops in the burning and sacking of Gallatin. Many of those with Patton in the Gallatin expedition, Parley P. Pratt, Dimmick Huntington, Morris Phelps, and others, now rode with him to Crooked River. John D. Lee, of Mountain Meadows Massacre fame, described him as a brave, impulsive man who rushed into the thickest of the fight regardless of the danger, end quote. Ebenezer Robinson said that Patton, highly esteemed and loved by his brethren, quote, seemed reckless of his life as though it was scarce worth preserving, end quote. The Mormon apostle reportedly told Joseph Smith that he would rather die than allow the persecution to continue. His courageous but impetuous nature seemed destined to lead him toward that end. Captain Patton wore a conspicuous white blanket overcoat that night as he led his men into battle, end quote. Now, I want to understand Captain Fearnought a little bit better, so let's include a little piece from Ebenezer Robinson's autobiography that Stephen LeSueur didn't include when quoting him in that passage. Now, I think this adds a lot of perspective to the person behind Captain Fearnought. Quote, he was brave to a fault, so much so that he was styled and called Captain Fearnought. He seemed reckless of his life, as though it was scarce worth preserving. There's where that was quoted by Stephen LeSueur, but this is where it continues, and I think it's very interesting. He had said to us, before there was any indication of a mob or difficulty with the people of Missouri, If I dared do it, I could wish myself dead. We did not feel at liberty to ask him any reason for such a wish, but presume it was on account of those things transpiring in the church, as we did not know of his having any domestic or financial troubles." End quote. I mean, even before the mob violence was a thing, Robinson said that Captain Fearnought dared to wish himself dead, even though nobody there could figure out what the problem was. I mean, it wasn't any problems with his domestic or financial troubles. It must have been something what was going on in the church. But I mean, let me ask you guys: do any of you listeners have a friend like this? Boisterous, loud, confident, brave on the outside, but maybe has some personal troubles on the inside? Hey, it's kind of interesting to gain this purview into the historical record that Ebenezer Robinson gives us here. I feel like it kind of enriches us as to who, David Patton really was. Captain Fearnought on the outside, but, David Patton with, what can we say? Suicidal thoughts. If I dare to do it, I could wish myself dead. That's a direct quote out of David Patton's mouth. Suicidal tendencies. That's terrifying. But let's advance a little bit further. We'll get back to what was going on with Patton here in just a second, but let's continue on in the autobiography of Peter H. Burnett. And as I said, archive.org version of this is in the show notes, but he describes the scene of Crooked River for us quite well. Quote, "Captain Bogart had retired into the edge of Ray County and encamped in a narrow bottom on the banks of a creek, among the large scattering oak timber and behind a slaw bank some 4 feet high. He apprehended an attack and had well selected his ground. The wagon road crossed the stream just below his encampment, and the road ran down the top and point of a long ridge, covered thickly with young hickories about 10 feet high and from 1 to 2 inches in diameter at the ground. No one could be seen approaching the encampment until arriving within a short distance of it, but Captain Bogart had placed out a picket guard on the road some half a mile above, at a point where open woods commenced." End quote. So just to clarify, we're setting up the scene here. It took Captain Fearnought and the Danites a few hours to actually organize and get themselves from Far West to Crooked River, and this is all in Caldwell County here. By the time they arrived, it was nearing 4 o'clock in the morning, and the first light of the sun would soon illuminate their inferior tactical position. But for some reason, David Patton, the fearless leader who earned the reputation of valiancy, deserving the name Captain Fearnought, thought it was a good idea to wear a white coat as the Danites approached Bogart's camp. Why? Why did he do this? I mean, who the fuck knows, right? Maybe he thought it was a sign of his purity. A white coat signifies just how righteous and white and delightsome he is. Or, maybe Joe promised that, he was sanctified and that he wouldn't die. Joe had given that revelation to Pistol Packin' Porter, said that, no blade or bullet will harm you. Maybe he gave the same revelation to Captain Fearnought here. I mean, who knows? Maybe, just maybe, Captain Fearnought thought that with the white coat he was going to blend in with the snow cover, while the majority of the other Danites were wearing darker clothes that blended into the night forest much better. Or maybe, just maybe, if we take what Ebenezer Robinson said into context of what happened here, maybe David Patton didn't want to live anymore. And he knew that this would be a heroic way to go out. A religious martyr. But seriously, there's no way to know truly why Fearnought wore such a conspicuous raiment in the middle of the night. It was a terrible idea. But let's continue on further through Burnett's personal recounting of the situation. He really sets it up for us quite well. Quote, "I remember well one of the 2 guards. His name was John Lockhart, a tall East Tennessean. Just before day, the Mormons were seen approaching and were hailed by the guards. But Receiving no satisfactory answer, the guards fired and then fled to the camp. One of the Mormons was killed here, but they fired no shot in return, made no halt, but continued their march in silence and good order, and drew up in line of battle immediately in front of Bogart's position, and about 40 yards distant. Not a word was said until the line was formed, and then orders were given to fire. Patton's men, being entirely exposed, suffered severely from the first fire, he himself being mortally wounded, and one or two of his men being killed and others wounded. He saw at a glance that his men could not stand such fire, while his enemies were protected by a slop bank, and he at once ordered his men to charge with their drawn swords. Bogart's men, having no swords, broke their ranks and fled. Several were overtaken in their retreat and either cut down or captured. Bogart had about 60, Patton 80 men, and 8 or 10 on each side were killed or wounded. One Mormon was evidently killed by his own companions, as his wound was a sword cut in the back of his head. Terrible. This is horrible. He had doubtless charged with more precipitancy than his comrades, and, as there was no difference in the dress of the opposing forces, he was mistaken for a retreating enemy. End quote. There's a lot to parse out there. Essentially, you have Bogart's men in the advantageous spot with a river on one side and a high bank on the other, and they're surrounded by trees. A natural fort, if you will. Captain Fearnought's Danites were out in the open with no cover and running a head-on assault of Bogart's natural fortification, but only did so after the guards had noticed them and fired at the Mormons and ran back to tell Bogart, sound the alarm and get everybody ready for an imminent attack. This is baffling. The tactics here are incredibly stupid. I mean, the Mormons didn't have the high ground, they no longer had the element of surprise, and they didn't have a chance of winning after discharging the first rounds in their guns. And yet, they still continued with the attack. This was patently stupid for them to follow through with. But after the initial firing line of the Mormons, Captain Fearnought, of course, realized the Mormons would never win a sustained battle and wouldn't survive a second volley. So with inferior tactics and position, Captain Fearnought went with the option of a man with nothing left. A sword charge. And in the ensuing chaos, Bogart's troops fled across the river which bordered the camp, and then Stephen LeSueur reconstructs the series of events from multiple first-hand accounts. So I'm just going to give credit where it's due. Quote, "The Mormon troops, shouting their watchword, 'God and Liberty,' drew their swords and flung themselves into the enemy ranks. Bogart's men panicked. Most of them immediately fled across the river, and those who remained were soon routed after brief hand-to-hand combat. Many of the soldiers shouted, 'We are brethren,' as they waded the river, hoping to halt the Mormons' fire until they could escape. Hosea Stout, a Mormon participant, later remarked that, quote, 'Many a mobber was there baptized without faith or repentance under the messengers of lead sent by the brethren,' end quote. What a badass, right? 2 Mormon soldiers intercepted Samuel Tarwater as he ran to the river and gave him several piercing cuts with their corn-cutter swords. One of the Mormons, Lorenzo D. Young, brother of the future Mormon prophet Brigham Young, said he saw an angel's hand hold Tarwater's arms so he could not return the blows. The Missourian, Tarwater, suffered a severed jaw and cuts about the throat and had his skull cut open and his upper teeth destroyed. Within minutes, the Mormons had routed the Missouri troops and sent them fleeing desperately to their homes." End quote. All right, that's the chaos that ensued at the Battle of Crooked River. And now, after this, Stephen LeSueur gives us a casualty count with numbers that are trusted by most Mormon historians today. When we read earlier from Burnett's recounting of the event, he claimed that 8 or 10 were wounded or killed on either side, and that's not entirely accurate. But that's the problem with rumors, right? I mean, people would hear numbers about casualties and continue on with the rest of their lives with these flawed numbers. You know, Burnett wrote that book in 1880. He was living with a false impression of the casualty numbers for his entire life. This is the reality of the situation, according to LeSueur and the broader realm of Mormon historians. Quote, "The Mormon soldiers quickly regrouped, loaded, and gathered their wounded. They suffered 9 men wounded, including Captain Patton and William Seeley, one of the captured spies. Seeley reported that the Missourians, when they saw that the Mormons were going to attack, placed the 3 prisoners in front of their line so they would be shot in the crossfire." So William Seeley, one of the people who the Mormons were there to rescue in the first place, was shot by the Mormons. It says here, "The prisoners broke for the Mormon line as soon as the firing began. Seeley was shot in the shoulder, but the other 2 escaped unharmed. Also among the wounded was James Hendricks, who lay face down, shot in the neck and unable to move. The Mormon soldier who discovered Hendricks did not recognize him. 'Which side are you on?' the soldier asked. 'God and liberty,' Hendricks replied," end quote, "with a bullet in his fucking neck." Oh, that's horrible. That's just, I can't even imagine what being in one of these scraps was like. Reading the firsthand accounts just only gives us a tiny snapshot into what the chaos must have really been like. To just be a deer in the woods watching this happening. It'd just be amazing to see how this really played out. But the Mormons captured 1 prisoner, a guy named Wyatt Cravens, whom they released before they reached Far West. Kind of a weird situation. And then soon after Cravens was released, he was mysteriously shot. Cravens and a number of others claimed that he was set up and deliberately shot by the Mormons. And unfortunately, Cravens actually recovered and testified against the Mormons at the Richmond hearing. So, I mean, there's so much for us to parse out here. I mean, when the Mormons made their assault, one of the first people shot was William Seeley. You know, he was one of the prisoners they were there to rescue in the first place. He didn't die, but it's reasonable to assume he was shot by the Mormons during the initial firing assault. And then secondly, of course, Captain Fearnought was shot, mortally wounded. Their Danite commanding officer and the morale of the entire assault force was fatally wounded during this initial assault. Altogether, 3 Mormons died with 7 wounded, while 1 Missourian, Moses Rowland, died, while 6 other militiamen were wounded. I mean, it's just so crazy. I don't even know how to describe this here. Let's read another account from my 1948 publication of the History of the Church. This is volume 3, page 171. Quote, "In the pursuit, one of the mob fled from behind a tree, wheeled, and shot Captain Patton, who instantly fell, mortally wounded, having received a large ball in his bowels." Giggity. "The ground was soon cleared, and the brethren gathered up a wagon or 2, and making beds therein of tents, etc., took their wounded and retreated towards Far West. 3 brethren were wounded in the bowels, 1 in the neck, 1 in the shoulder, 1 through the hips, 1 through both thighs, 1 in the arms, all by musket shot. 1 had his arm broken by a sword." I have to add, only the Mormons had swords in this situation, so somebody fucked up. "Brother Gideon Carter was shot in the head and left dead on the ground, so defaced that the brethren did not know him. Bogart reported that he lost 1 man. The 3 prisoners were released and returned with the brethren to Far West. Captain Patton was carried some of the way in a litter, but it caused so much distress that he begged to be left by the wayside." Of course, there's a bullet in his bowels. It's hard to transport somebody that's hurting that bad. Every bump in the road must have sent shooting pains through his body. It's just terrifying. He was carried into Brother Winchester's 3 miles from the city of Far West, where he died that night. Patrick O'Banion died soon after, and Brother Carter's body was also brought from Crooked River when it was discovered who he was. I went with my brother Hiram and Lyman White to meet the brethren on their return near Log Creek, where I saw Captain Patton in the most distressing condition. His wound was incurable. Brother David Patton was a very worthy man, beloved by all good men who knew him. He was one of the 12 apostles and died as he had lived, a man of God, and strong in the faith of a glorious resurrection, in a world where mobs have no power or place. One of his last expressions to his wife was, "Whatever you do else, do not deny the faith." End quote. This is a quote from Violet Kimball, who was living in Far West at the time, and she describes Ann Patton, Captain Fearnought's wife, to whom he spoke those dying words. Quote, "I can never forget her fearless and determined look. Around her waist was a belt to which was attached a large bowie knife. She had a fire in her stove and a large iron kettle full of boiling water and a big tin dipper in her hand, intending, she said, to fight if any of the demons came there. She did not seem in the least excited. Her countenance was perfectly calm, and she shed no tears." End quote. And thus, David W. Patton, husband of this ass-kicking Ann Patton, a man who joined our timeline back in June of 1832, a truly monumental figure of valiancy and bravery, became the first Mormon apostle who was martyred for the cause. From his early 1833 mission to New York with Reynolds Calhoun, where they converted 80 people, supposedly, all the way to marching with Zion's Camp in 1834, through the Kirtland Safety Society Company counterfeiting scandal, the Fanny Alger affair, and everything else that's happened in our timeline since 1832, Captain Fearnought, David W. Patton, is laid to rest, having given his life for a cause that he thought was worthy. And maybe that's enough, right? He'd been told by everybody surrounding him that dying for God is a good thing. And dying for God is indeed what he did, in his mind. Neither of those things were true, but they were true in his mind as his neural pathways were slowly giving out. Patton died a hero in his mind. And, given what Ebenezer Robinson said earlier describing David Patton, maybe he had his deepest secret wish granted. This Battle of Crooked River produced no clear winner. The Mormons had successfully chased off Bogart's vigilante mob, but they'd suffered greater casualties, including their field commanding officer who died. This is how the aftermath is described in B.H. Roberts' History of the Church, once again from my 1930 copy. Quote, "The results of this engagement between the company of Caldwell militia and Bogart's patrol was greatly exaggerated at the time. The news of the fight on Crooked River spread rapidly," says one account. "All the Gentiles in the northern part of the county abandoned their homes and fled southward near Richmond and elsewhere for safety, believing that a general raid upon them by the Mormons was imminent." Why would they stop, right? "The Mormons had fired the first gun and were to be considered the aggressors, and wherever the news was received, there was a general and vehement demand that they be at once put down, severely punished for what they had done, and effectually disposed of." End quote. Now, when the Mormons had first conducted their raids upon Daviess County 4 days before this Crooked River battle, 2 messengers were sent to meet with Governor Lilburn Boggs personally and petition him for assistance and report what the Mormons had done, their depredations. These men were named Amos Reese and Wiley Williams. Now, on the morning of October 25th, Judge E.M. Ryland of Lexington received word about the Battle of Crooked River and sent an express letter to these men, Amos Reese and Wiley Williams, informing them of the battle at Crooked River. Now, of course, Judge Ryland was working from intel he'd received from one of Bogart's men who'd fled through the night to Lexington. The problem is, with all the pandemonium we've been discussing, Bogart's men fled in all directions. They scattered like cockroaches to a spotlight. Many of them supposing that the majority of their brethren had died at the hands of the Mormons. Now, they ran away. They didn't know what was left behind them. But this is how Ebenezer Robinson describes the problem in his autobiography. Quote, "The attack upon Bogart and the mob under his command at Crooked River added wonderfully to the excitement already existing in Upper Missouri and created widespread alarm on account of the exaggerated statements made with regard to it. The report went abroad and circulated like wildfire that Bogart and all his company, amounting to between 50 and 60 men, were massacred by the Mormons except 3, whereas only one of his men was killed." End quote. But everybody was working off that information. The Mormons knew it wasn't true. They knew that they didn't massacre 60 men because they didn't recover Gideon Carter's body from a pile of 60 other dead men. He was pretty much the only dead guy remaining at Crooked River. But the rumors spread to important people quickly. Namely to this Judge E.M. Ryland, who spread the word to Amos Reese and Wiley Williams, who were on their way to meet with Governor Boggs to ask him personally for assistance. But it also got out to Atchison, Donovan, Parks, Clark, Gilliam, a bunch of other military commanders. And Boggs was in the middle of reacting to the Mormon depredations in Daviess County when he received word of the battle at Crooked River. Now, before Boggs had received word of the battle, he had issued orders to collect the most incredibly massive militia we've seen yet in this conflict. But the aggressive actions by the Mormons against Bogart had the effect of exciting everybody in the nearby counties. You know, people living in Livingston and Clay and Ray and Saline and Clinton and all the other counties surrounding Daviess and Caldwell, they figured that the Mormons would next expand their depredations to include those counties instead of limiting themselves to Daviess and attacking Bogart in Caldwell. You know, it's not a hard conclusion to draw, right? The Mormons had chased every single non-Mormon from their home in Daviess County, and now they had supposedly massacred Bogart's army. What would they do next? Which county would they move on and, plunder and burn next? I mean, these were levels of questions that people just didn't know how to react to. And of course, the uncertainty that was based on rumors alone, they caused Governor Boggs to react according to a worst case scenario instead of proportionately to the reality of the situation. This is from B.H. Roberts' Comprehensive History of the Church, Volume 1, page 477. Quote, "Before arrival of Misters Williams and Reese," now that's who we're talking about, Reese and Williams, who were on their way to go meet with Boggs personally, in Jefferson City, Governor Boggs, acting upon the false reports that reached him concerning affairs at Gallatin and Millport, that's the Mormon depredations, ordered into the field a large force of the state militia. Under date of 26th of October, he ordered out 400 men from each of the following divisions, the 1st, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 12th, making a body of 2,000 troops. At the same time, General Willock of the 14th Division was ordered to raise 500 men. Generals Donovan and Parks were ordered each to raise 500 men, but no steps were taken by them to carry out this order, doubtless for the reason that the rapid development of events gave them no opportunity to do so. And they were already in the field, each in command of a large force, about 1,800 men in the two commands." End quote. All right, so the next part of this passage is very important. Okay, this is when it gets absolutely insane. Quote, "The above military orders were issued by Governor Boggs in response to an application of the citizens of Daviess County by the governor, quote, for protection and to be restored to their homes and property," end quote. The orders were given because the governor claimed to have received intelligence that the Mormons, with an armed force, had expelled the inhabitants of that county from their homes, had pillaged and burnt their dwellings, driven off their stock, and were destroying their crops. That they, meaning the Mormons, had burnt to ashes the towns of Gallatin and Millport in said county, the former being the county seat of said county. And there was not now a civil officer within said county, end quote. Just as the Mormons were done fucking around, Boggs was completely fed up with these reports he was receiving at an arm's length. And he too was done fucking around with the Mormon madness, which had been consuming all of his time and corroding his political career for the past 4 months. This was the army to end all Mormon violence. This army of 3,500 men was organized to quell the Mormon rebellion once and for all in reaction to their depredations in Daviess County. But that's just to the raiding and pillaging that they had conducted. Just as Boggs signed this order and was about to expedite it to the relevant militia commanders in the field, Amos Reese and Wiley Williams arrived to Governor Boggs' office and told him the rumors they had heard. They told Boggs the Mormons had assaulted Captain Bogart's troops, killed nearly all of them, and took the remaining few as prisoner. And then they were also able to rescue the prisoners whom Bogart had captured as prisoners of war in the first place, inciting this Mormon militia violence. In case the militia commanders weren't sure exactly what to do with their 3,500 men who were just organized to march on Far West and Diahman, reactively, Boggs issued another executive order, dated the next day, known as the Missouri Executive Order Number 44, referred to henceforth as the Mormon Extermination Order. This order was a turning point. To show everybody the Missouri government would no longer placate these religious fanatics by some, 19th century appeasement answered primarily by citizen vigilante militias. It was time to properly deal with the Mormon problem. I can't wait to go over the Mormon Extermination Order with you guys, because there's just seriously so much to discuss. But I have to admit, I don't know much about the legal realm surrounding the order because I'm no political historian. I'm just fascinated by politics, but largely ignorant. The only expertise that I have concerning law has come from my good friend Andrew Torrez, legal counsel for Ground Gnomes LLC, and of course, as you know him, co-host of the incredibly awesome Opening Arguments podcast. So I figured, you know what? I'm just going to invite him on the show here, and we can go over the legality of Governor Boggs' Mormon Extermination Order. Andrew, welcome to the show, and thanks for coming on.
Hi, Bryce. Thank you very much for having me on the show. I really, I've said this offline and to you in person, but long before I was a podcaster, I was a fan of Naked Mormonism. I love this show. I love what you're doing. I listen to every episode, and I am really, really excited to be on the show.
Well, I mean, I'm just super stoked to have you on the show more than anything because Opening Arguments truly is my new favorite atheist and skeptical show because you take all of the stories, the inflammatory news items that Cogdiss and Scathing Atheist talk about, and you actually analyze them down at the granular and law level, and it's just so fascinating. But of course, like you guys have done specials that are just amazing, like specific topics. Hillary Clinton's emails and the Second Amendment rights and sovereign citizens, like all of these separate topics that are just so fascinating, but you don't realize how fascinating they are until you actually dive in, which is what you and Thomas do. You guys have such an awesome show. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, let's get started because we got a lot to get through today. I brought you on to talk about the Mormon Extermination Order, of which I believe you're slightly familiar, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
Yeah, I am. So happy to talk about it.
All right. That's fantastic. Because there is some very legalese type verbiage in here that I was hoping to get your expertise on. So why don't we just get started by reading kind of the important part of this Mormon Extermination Order, Executive Order Number 44. We're starting to fall in love with executive orders in this country, aren't we? So let's just read the beginning part of this extermination order because it's appalling to say the least. Do you want to read it for us here? Andrew?
Sure. And let me just say, like, as a preface, this is Executive Order 44, issued by Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs. It is a direct analog. In the news right now, we are considering and analyzing the presidential executive orders being promulgated by President Trump. Governors have the same. Well, that's a subject. That's a subject for another show. But governors have the same power in that in their analogous capacity as the chief executive of states, and so this order was promulgated by the governor of Missouri, and it reads as follows. It is to General John B. Clark, headquarters of the militia in Jefferson, Missouri, and it says, "Sir, since the order of this morning to you, directing you to cause 400 mounted men to be raised within your division, I have received, via these various individuals, one of my aides, information of the most appalling character, which entirely changes the face of things, and places the Mormons in the attitude of an open and avowed defiance of the laws, and, having made war upon the people of this state, your orders are, therefore, to hasten your operation with all possible speed. The Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace. Their outrages are beyond all description." And then the rest of the text, is, technical details about mustering up the militia and getting more militiamen.
It's all strategy after that. Yeah. But that was the operational part of this extermination order, and why it was called the extermination order.
Yeah, right.
I mean, that's appalling. This is just absolutely absurd to think, and it's signed to Lilburn W. Boggs, Commander-in-Chief, being Governor-Commander-in-Chief of the state's militia. Andrew, you say oftentimes in opening arguments, it's all about how you ask the question, right? It's not, is it illegal if I do this? It's, what will happen to me if I do this? So right. I'm going to go with the first question. Is this legal at all? I mean, what, exterminating people and removing them?
Yeah, so let me give you a kind of classic opening arguments answer, which is it might be more legal than you think.
That's horrifying.
Yeah. So probably not, right? Like I want to be very, very clear. Probably not. But sort of you've incorporated the second prong of your question. Regardless of the status, it went into effect and was promulgated and was used to well, I think you're going to save that for another show. But the answer to the first question is, if an order like this were made today, it's very, very clear that it would violate the Constitution, right? And in particular, it would violate the 5th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution, which guarantee to any individual that no state shall deprive that person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And here you are depriving people of lives, liberty, and property without due process of law.
Quite literally. So, I mean, and this is just
exactly,
given, like, this is mob action. This is just ammunition for a mob to go chase people out of their homes, really.
Yeah, there's both halves of that are satisfied. That people lost their homes, people lost their lives, people lost their liberty to remain within the state of Missouri and to not have an angry mob follow them with weapons. So and there's no process, right? Like it's just the governor says, yeah, you guys are enemies, get the hell out.
Right. Well, given what happens after Joseph and the leadership are arrested, it's a really good thing that we have that due process involved in our system of law, because I mean they could have fallen victim to being any of these people just chased out or massacred or whatever the case may be. But I mean, given kind of like the Jacksonian type of era they were going through here, where they were, coming out of the Jackson presidency, who had just, I mean, basically his entire sales pitch was like, hey, we want the land that those Indians are on. We're going to chase them off. And that's just accept it, deal with it. There's a subhuman class of people. So, I mean, this is kind of like the mob rule type of ideology. Seems like it was driving a lot of social pressures at the time, and the Mormons kind of just fell victim to it. It just so happens they have a governor who hates the Mormons just as much as all the mobocrats that will issue an order like this of such an appalling character. So, yep. I mean, is it really terribly out of the norm in this day for something like this to happen, though?
Well, I mean, but I want to talk about that. But before we get there, you sort of let pass over that. Today, it's clear that this order would be unconstitutional. But you may have noticed that the primary place that I went in terms of declaring it unconstitutional today is the 14th Amendment.
Which
this order
didn't exist.
Right, yeah. Right. This order was promulgated in 1838, so 30 years before the 14th Amendment was passed. And that's, it turns out that's really, really important. Okay. I said the 5th and 14th Amendment. So let me read you the relevant clause from the 5th Amendment, but then let me give you the giant asterisk that we would put on it. Okay. So the 5th Amendment says in relevant part, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Right. Oh, so fair. Pretty clear, awesome. Right? Like why doesn't the same analysis apply that applies to the 14th Amendment, right? Which says no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And the reason there is that prior to 1868, the terms of the Bill of Rights were not deemed to apply to state action. They applied only to action by the central federal government. And if you look back in our nation's history, right, you can see in the Federalist Papers, you can see the writings of our founding fathers. They had a view that that the overreaches, this is from their history of interacting with the British Crown, but that overreaches came from national government, and that your local government was there to protect you. And so, however, that was, I think, not well borne out by history as part of the shows.
Well, and I know that like Joseph Smith was a states' rights kind of guy, and I mean the vast majority of like slave owners and people living in Missouri and stuff were states' rights type of people. But the Jacksonian era, I mean, Jackson was really hard about preserving the Union, from what I understand. Yeah. So seeing like this states' rights type of ideology come forward, it seems like that was a problem on many different levels for many different people, because you can have a governor like Governor Boggs, who is, what Joe would label as a mobocrat. He could, catch the anti-Mormon bug and then feel justified in writing something like this. And because he's, a states' rights type of governor, this is actually essentially legal. I mean, it's extra legal, but it's legal at the time.
Yeah, well, and let me put an asterisk on that, and I want to come back to it.
Thank you.
Because, I don't want to conclude that it's legal. What I want to say is the Mormons in 1838 would not have had a Fifth Amendment remedy against this executive order, right? So take as an analog when President Trump promulgated what's been called the Muslim ban. Individuals who were trapped in airports immediately went to the ACLU, and they had a habeas corpus right, a constitutional remedy against even state action, right? Like even if it were now they're being detained in the airport, that was mostly by federal Department of Homeland Security agents. Mm-hmm. But even if it were state police who were detaining people, I don't know that for a fact. So entertain that as a bit of a hypothetical.
And I have to pause you there, because just given the text of what was going on in this extermination order and what happened in 1838, the Mormons were the persecuted religious minority.
Right.
Mormons should be outraged at this Muslim ban that's happened, because 180 years ago it was them.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, it's why I made the parallel. You are more tightly connected to the Mormon community than I am. What and the Mormons, obviously, Utah was more of a contested state in the election, even though it's a solid Republican area. I mean, Mormons seem to have a generally low opinion of Donald Trump to begin with. What has the reaction from their community been? Right? Are they anti the Muslim ban, or are they speaking up against it? What do you see out there on the ground?
I haven't seen much about it from, like insular Mormon communities. I honestly, I intermingle with believing Mormons very, very little. Mm-hmm. But I can't understand how. Well, I know that the Utah had, this highest possibility of a third party elector to the Republican Party. It was this McMillan guy, I think was his name.
Yeah, McMullen.
Yeah, McMullen. And he had a fair amount of votes behind him, but it's not like he took those votes away from, Hillary supporters or Bernie supporters.
Yeah, no.
Those were all red votes already. So
Right.
They just happened to split between Trump and McMullen. But, the Utah is one of the reddest states there is. It's incredibly red. So I have to assume that there are at least some Mormons who are like, yeah, get those Muslims out of here. But
well, yeah, no,
they're just ignorant of history, because it could have been, Missourians saying the same exact thing about the Mormons 180 years ago.
You and you have talked about this in some of your special episodes. If there is any greater sad political irony than Mormons lining up and the Mormon Church institutionally lining up in quote support of traditional marriage, I don't know what there is. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if they were going to destroy. But my point there is just that there may be reasons to think that. That they may not be sort of towing the Republican lines. I will take a look. I think it's an interesting situation on the ground. I think the parallels are really clear there. So to try and extricate out of this rabbit hole that I dug us into, the refugees who were detained, regardless of whether it was state or federal action, had the ability to assert their constitutional rights because of the application of the 14th Amendment. That it says now you can assert that against state actors as well as the federal government. But prior to 1868, and in fact prior to the early part of the 20th century, there's a doctrine called incorporation, and it means exactly, well, I was going to say it means exactly what it sounds like, but I think that's not true. It means exactly what it sounds like to lawyers, and maybe not to to individuals. There was after the passage of the 14th Amendment, it was the view of the Supreme Court, right or left over history, that the 14th Amendment was intended to take the provisions of the Bill of Rights and incorporate them to the states, right? In other words, to say, so for example, right, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, et cetera, et cetera. And how can you assert a First Amendment claim against, say, your state government? And the answer is because the 14th Amendment incorporated the First Amendment to the states. And so now...
Okay, so before this, it was like each state had their own Bill of Rights, their own Constitution and everything, and the federal Constitution essentially didn't really apply to those states before the 14th Amendment?
In terms of the protections of the Bill of Rights, that's absolutely correct. I know that shocks a lot of people, but yeah, and many provisions of the Bill of Rights were not incorporated to the states until 1910s, 1920s. I think the latest decision was in the 1930s.
Wow!
And so, well, in fact, let me say
for alcohol, I was going to say, right?
I can't come up with the individual decision, but I can actually say it this way: there was no Supreme Court decision incorporating the Second Amendment to the states until 2008. So you want to talk about the incorporation doctrine? We got our federal Bill of Rights incorporated down to the states, being able to be asserted against state actors in a piecemeal fashion over a long period of time, and more recently in history than a lot of people would think. So, but you said a very, very important thing in that sentence, which is states do have state constitutions. And so I don't know what the status of the Missouri Constitution was in 1838. If the Missouri Constitution had an analog to the Fifth Amendment, which it probably did, right? Like, it's more likely than not that it did. Then the Mormons would have had a state law right to apply to the state for the protection of their life, liberty, or property, and to challenge the Executive Order 44, the Mormon extermination order. But yeah, go ahead.
I mean, the laws are only so good until, to the point that you have somebody that will defend those, defend you and the application of those laws to you. I mean, after the Mormons were chased out of Missouri, and Joseph was released from Liberty Jail, he went and met with Martin Van Buren, the president at the time, and was like, hey, we were chased out of Illinois. This is not fair. And even Van Buren was like, well, you guys are Mormons. I can't side with you. It'll be the death of my political career, which is what happened to Boggs. Boggs is absolutely cancerous to his entire politic after this. Everything fell apart for him. But if the president of the United States isn't going to defend your rights against, these mobs, who will, right? Nobody else can. So in that case, having a Fifth Amendment or a Fifth Amendment analog in the Missouri State Constitution, it doesn't seem like it would even matter at this stage.
Yeah. So you bring up two things there, both of which I think are really important to discuss, right? So the first is the importance of an independent judiciary. And this is something that, as an opening arguments listener, like I rail on about all the time, right? Like the reason why we are supposed to have a nonpartisan independent judiciary, the reason why judges are appointed for life terms is because you're supposed to have the ability for individuals to bypass political mob rule and go to an independent body who can look and say, no, the law is clearly X, and we will step in and vindicate your rights. Again, I haven't done, I'm not an expert on early 19th century Missouri law, which is not the most lucrative of legal subspecialties.
Right.
But that being said, right, like, so we don't know what the provision was. I have a 95+% confidence interval that Missouri had an analog to the Fifth Amendment. But we don't know, we've lost in history what applications or pleas the Mormons made after the entry of this order. But what we do know is they didn't find anyone to stop it, right? Unlike, the ACLU was able to win a court case literally the day after on a Saturday and get a temporary restraining order that applied to the hundreds of refugees who were being detained at airports, even though they had valid immigration visas or had been approved through the refugee process. The wheels of justice moved very, very quickly in that instance, which was a really good thing. We know that the wheels of justice didn't move at all for the Mormons in response to this order.
Yeah.
So,
and they had to take the law into their own hands. Right. They'd been consolidated and chased out of their homes down to, Daviess and Caldwell counties, and nobody would, conduct a business with them. The Mormons were starving. That's why they went and committed their depredations in the first place and went and, plundered and burned people's houses because they were starving. Like, the Mormons had no other options. And then that, of course, just in turn escalated things and essentially gave license to Boggs in order to write this extermination order. It was all reactive. It was this positive feedback loop of, bad energy that the Mormons weren't getting any relief. Nobody was coming to their side to aid them. And then, of course, when General Atchison and Donovan and Parks, those were the three generals that were friendly to the Mormons. When the Mormons needed them the most, they were absorbed into the larger anti-Mormon vigilante militia.
Yeah.
And, the Mormons had nowhere to turn except to themselves. And I guess maybe that's the most terrifying part about this
Yeah. The one thing that you've correctly described it being terrifying and awful, which I think is a good way to describe it. But I don't want to lose track of the second thing you had said, which is I don't want to use the phrase silver lining, but which is, at least as you fit things into, the puzzle of history, it's a positive sign that prior to 1838, Lilburn Boggs was a prominent governor of a frontier state. It is. I cannot say that he was a surefire future presidential candidate, but I can say that at the time, governors of states were on a very, very short list. So yeah, I can't say that Lilburn Boggs would have been, a candidate for the presidency within a few years. But what I can say is it's not implausible that he would have been, right? He was a prominent governor. His political star was on the rise. If there were only, 20 odd states at the time. And so if you were a governor of a state, like you woke up every morning and, looked at yourself in the mirror and adjusted your like wacky early 19th century tie and said, I could be president someday, right? Like that was not an implausible, thing to think. And after issuing,
Joseph Smith did that. I mean, it wasn't just
it's the
not
governors.
Only,
but I mean, Boggs had a not implausible path to the presidency. And after issuing this order, he was vilified. He never held another political office again. His star went from ascendant to black hole implosion. He paid a political price for this, even though, as you point out, Mormons were a scary, weird, other religious cult. But nevertheless, what I would infer from history was that that this kind of reaction of sort of giving into, our basest and worst instincts of we don't know who these people are and we're scary and they're weird and they're polygamous and so let's kill them all, like that. It was terrible that happened, but at least
it has
at least there were
ramifications.
political repercussions, and so if you want to extrapolate forward, I mean hopefully that the American character has not changed so much that that's still what's going to happen when we kind of give into our worst impulses.
I really hope so. I couldn't agree more with you. And I guess it would even speak more to that point, knowing that Governor Atchison or General Atchison and Doniphan, as well as like General Lucas and General Clark, these pro-Mormon as well as these anti-Mormon generals that were in this conflict, they later went on to have, very positive political careers or military careers and continued to serve the Union for the rest of their lives. So, Lilburn Boggs, he issued this horribly brash and just ill-advised order, and he felt the wrath of it. Rightfully so. He should have felt the wrath. Whereas, the people that were acting sensibly, that were actually, following the due process of law, they continued to have very successful political careers. So, I agree with your point. I guess, even if it doesn't seem like, sweet justice right at the time, he didn't get his foot caught in a door and broken or something. And, we didn't see something bad happen to him immediately after he issued this. It all kind of came out in the end that it's like, yeah, he kind of got screwed over.
Yeah. I try, it's a challenge these days. My political beliefs are kind of, made public, and so are yours. But one of the reasons I became a lawyer, one of the reasons I'm still a lawyer is that, I have this, fundamental belief in the goodness of the American judicial system and the
that's serious. That goes against every single lawyer joke I've heard in my entire life. So I don't.
Well, hopefully you've heard some.
You
good
must be
ones.
an anomaly.
So
that's what I'm saying.
I would love to hear your best lawyer joke, because I tend to get the same 5 or 6 where you can do that sort of Jackie the Joke Man thing where you give the punchline and I'll give the setup. But
we can't go there. We will offend every single one lawyer listener of the show. So we can't go there. We got to be as open and
fair enough.
Nice for everybody as possible.
I am a big fan. I'm a big fan of lawyer jokes. I think that far too many people in my profession take themselves far too seriously, and you ought to lighten up a little bit. So. But that's
well, and I mean, there are lawyer jokes, and then there are jokes for lawyers. And if you want the jokes for the lawyers, opening arguments is your place. What I did want to ask as well, kind of, talking about the historical realm. Mm-hmm. Are there any possible analogs to this extermination order? I mean. Anywhere in all of American history, do we have analogs that, a governor or a senator or anybody that has, executive authority at this level issued an order like this for any other subsect of people? I guess Native Americans, that's kind of the exception, because this is all we really did to them was exterminate them,
right?
Remove or exterminate them. But I'm talking about, other white Americans that are perpetrating these things against other white Americans.
Yeah, and that's a good distinction, because when you frame the question that way, are there other executive orders targeting groups of American citizens, which at the time, right, we are talking, unambiguous American citizens. We are talking about white male property holders who, were the subject of this order, right? And
that's not to minimize the suffering and the troubles that happened to the Native Americans. I don't want to say that at all.
Yeah, you and I are. I mean, you have been loud and long in condemning the Trail of Tears and the atrocities committed against Native Americans, and obviously we agree with that. But it's not analogous from a legal standpoint because of the legal conditions that were in place at the time, right? So on the one hand, the answer to your question is no. There's no other executive order that targets a religious minority in the way that the Mormon extermination order did. In the larger historical context, though, I think there are analogs, and the one that sort of immediately comes to mind that is another good example of sort of how history has been whitewashed in just the past 20 or 30 years is the ongoing conflicts between Protestants and Catholics in this country. And, today we think of that, like when I say Protestant-Catholic conflict, right, you think Northern Ireland, right? Like that is something that happens.
Yeah. I mean, that's like, we don't have to deal with that here. I mean, that's not a thing here anymore.
And even when you think back to, we've all seen the black and white photo of the, no Irish need apply and things like that. It seems kind of a quaint, historical anachronism. But the reality is that up until very, very recently, and by recently I mean 1979, right? Like up until my lifetime, if not your lifetime, the Protestants, particularly conservative Protestants, did not consider Catholics to be Christians. It was only with the founding of the Moral Majority by Jerry Falwell in the 1970s and the ascendancy of the religious right as a political force in the 1980s that you had an ecumenical organization that brought together Protestants of all stripes, Catholics, and even in many cases Jews for the Judeo-Christian to try and maximize those numbers as a lobbying group, right? The concept, so Judeo-Christian as a word is 30 years old. It is a nonsense concept because throughout virtually all of human history, Christians and Jews have been bitter enemies. But even the notion of that a Catholic and a Protestant would walk into the same room and consider each other to be fellow Christians that concept is 38 years old in this country at most. Prior to that,
wow. And that's just so weird to add that historical perspective on this, because I'm 25,
right?
Like this, none of it. Sorry, 26 now. I mean, none of this makes sense.
Happy
to me.
Happy birthday, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much.
So let's go back historically to about this same time, right? 1830s, 1840s. There were the same level of conflicts between Protestants and Catholics that you had between Protestants and Mormons, and for the same reason, right? Like, so for example, I think it was in the last historical episode, you were talking about how when Mormons reached a critical mass in certain counties, they then became able to influence the political results of elections, right? And so now it was not just, okay, we all hate these weird foreigners, but it was, okay, we have to decide between, do we hate these weird foreigners or do we go after these weird foreigners as the swing vote, right? And
right, yeah. Do we start pandering for their votes? Of course.
And so that when you hit the point of political significance is when you also hit kind of the tipping point for extra legal, extra political violence, right? Which is to say, oh, we can't pander to you, and we've already, defined our political brand as being in opposition to you. So now what we need to do is disenfranchise you, and or make sure that you can't effectively cast votes for our opponents. And the way to do that is, one way to do that, I should say, is through angry mob justice. And so,
you're right, a Gallatin Day election battle, something like that.
And there is the equivalent of the Gallatin Day election battle. The one that comes to mind is called Bloody Monday. It's August 6th, 1855 in Louisville, Kentucky. And it's the same. It's the exact same situation, right? Which is to say, this was a time. This is 1855. This was the very height of the America First Party, the Know Nothing Party, the original America First Party.
Oh, yay.
So you had, in the wake of Andrew Jackson, the collapse of the Whigs, and political parties were trying to pick up the pieces. And one party that picked up the pieces for a very, very short period of time, but influential, was a party that called itself the Know Nothing Party. They registered as the American Union Party on when they nominated Millard Fillmore for president in 1856. But the Know Nothing Party was populist, anti-immigration, nativist. I'm not even going to draw the dots, to connect up, to the analog to President Trump, because it's the exact same kind of alignment of forces, and with
a small political minority that just gathers barely enough voice to be a presence for a certain amount of time.
And they were virulently anti-Catholic, and for the same reasons as the Gallatin Day events, and it was. Look, what's happening is these European nations are sending over their Catholics, and they're aggregating together in localities where they can achieve majorities. And when they get into power, they're going to turn our government over to Rome, and these papists are going to rule based on what the Pope tells them to do. And so, on Election Day in August of 1855, an armed mob, which was inflamed by and spoken to and led by members of the Know Nothing Party and sympathetic newspapers, went to, quote, guard the polls. Right, we saw that this past election, and they said, we're going to go monitor and make sure these are free and fair elections. And as a result, on that day alone, I think 15 people were shot. and there are a number. This is the most prominent one, but there are numerous examples of sort of election day poll watching violence of the Protestant majority, going out on a vigil and escalating into armed conflict in Catholic neighborhoods. And there are examples of, burning down houses and, retaliations by Catholics against Protestants. And that's, like I said, that's not the Irish Republican art. Like, that's our nation's history. And
that's right. That sounds like something straight out of the medieval time. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, I guess it wouldn't be Protestantism, hadn't arisen yet, but it does sound like one of the many small religious insurrections that happened in, the Roman Catholic umbrella. So it's just absolutely incredible to see these analogs, but, coming from, I guess it's these warring religions against each other, and the vast majority of the people that were in Missouri that were opposing the Mormons were Methodists at the time. A lot of them were Methodist preachers and whatnot. So, I mean, we have to talk about, or we have to at least mention that the religious aspect definitely played its fair part in what happened here. I mean, the Mormons were crazy religious fanatics, just as much as they were poor refugees that were, squatting on land, essentially. So there's, a whole amalgamation of different social pressures that led up to this extermination order. But I think Mormons can at least pride themselves on knowing that they are the recipients of the only executive order in all of American history to be exterminated by an actual mob. They had their own piece of paper written from a governor that said they're special enough to get removed from the state. So at least Mormons are really weird, and they have a colored and sordid past. And I like to see it kind of in the historical realm of what was actually going on at the time, and talking about the Protestant and Catholic wars. Essentially, I think that adds a bit of perspective to this. Like, the Mormons weren't alone when it came to religious persecution or to, land-based violence. This is just incredible to see this kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, I won't go to too many rabbit trail, but what I was going to say is, to me, when I look at history, it is part of the compelling argument for the Jeffersonian view of the First Amendment as establishing a wall of separation between church and state. And it used to be that Protestants, in fact, because of this history of conflict, they were on the side of the secularists. They were some of the most active and vocal groups in promoting and lobbying for the notion of complete separation between the government and the church, because they feared, the infiltration and acquisition of our government by, and ceding it over to the Pope in Rome.
Well, yeah, because many of them were immigrants from Europe that was under the arm of the Pope the whole time they were living there. So yeah, of course.
Yep. And so, you look back at this, throughout history. So, for example, one of the legacies of the Know Nothing Party was the rise of Senator James G. Blaine, who would later be a candidate for president. And while a senator, Blaine failed to get passed as a constitutional amendment, but inspired, I think, 35 separate states to pass what were called Blaine amendments, which say that no state funds can be used to directly aid a church. And so, that was passed. The motivation, again, was this sort of anti-Catholic bigotry. And that, is a regrettable, and I certainly don't endorse, bigotry towards anyone of any religious group. But the way it was put into practice was, hey, we're afraid that that there's going to be excessive entanglement between the state and this particular religious sect. And so what we're going to say is, even for ourselves, we want this absolute wall. We don't want $1 to pass from the state treasury into the coffers of any particular church. And so, I find those amendments, kind of regardless of the motivation, to be, valuable aspects of law that are still on the books in many states, and they can help block, some of our contemporary issues that we see, that are issues in our community today, right? So things like, faith. Giving money to faith-based organizations on a state-based level, things like voucher programs to give money to parents to take their kids out of public schools and send them to private religious schools for, conservative fundamentalist indoctrination education. Those things come up against the reality of state constitutions that have Blaine amendments in them. So I guess that's a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I think, you and I and a lot of us that are in our that are in this community and our listeners, feel very strongly about the separation of church and state. But this is why, right? Like when you do not, you wind up with the kind of armed conflict that gives rise to things like the extermination order or the conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, and it's why I think that the current religious right is really, really short-sighted, because once you wear down that wall, you begin kind of the sectarian free-for-all of, okay, we're open to government goodies. Are those government goodies, are they going to go to Mormons? Are they going to go to Scientologists? Right. Are they going to go to, other crazy? No. It's only supposed to go to mainstream Christian, the people that we brought into the moral majority. And drawing that line is tough. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox now. It's your show. I apologize.
Well, no, you know what? And I'm just going to jump right back onto that soapbox and echo what you're saying with, another tangent here, because one thing that I love about history is how deeply it's intertwined with everything else. I mean, there's no way to understand how things are today unless we understand how they came to be the way that they are. And, just speaking at the very foundation of law studies, it is a historical study. We're studying the history of law. I mean, we cite, I've heard you cite many, many times in opening arguments. Every episode you cite, well, we have to go back to this hearing that happened in 1930 or in, 2004, or, we go back to these times when there was something going on that led up to a Supreme Court ruling or to a law being made. And then we have to cite that law for what is applying to what's going on today. Like you said, whether it's a voucher program or, any number of other issues that the atheist and skeptical community frequently engages with. But, the very foundation of studying law is understanding that it didn't just pop up out of nowhere. We have an entire, history of jurisprudence to base our conclusions upon. And I have to say that's probably one reason why I love Thomas Takes the Bar segment so much, is because it forces us to say, okay, what would be the most logical decision? And, why is that a logical decision given what we've heard in cases before and given the outcomes of previous cases? Because the level, the judicial orders that have come down from the past are what we base our current law off of today. And when you look at it with the historical realm, things tend to make so much more sense. And I guess that's why I'm just so interested in opening arguments on what you and Thomas do and why it's so much fun to listen, because seriously, like, I've been studying 1830 politics now for the past few months to try and understand this, and now I'm studying those same politics of today's stance, only with much more depth, thanks to what you and Thomas are doing. So, with that, I have to say, Andrew, thank you so much for coming onto the show and for shedding some light on this Mormon extermination order for us, and talking about the history, because this is just an anomaly in American history. This is just absolutely mind-blowing to see this happen, and I'm glad I could call on somebody who's an actual law expert, a real live lawyer, and, pair you with Skeptical Inquirer this episode to really get to the bottom of this extermination order. So, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. If people want to find you and hear more of your incredibly witty and insightful tidbits on law, where can they go to find you?
So they can go to openargs.com. They can follow us on Twitter at openargs, or look for the Opening Arguments podcast page, like it, follow it on Facebook. They can also find both me and Thomas on Facebook. We're not hard, and we're not hard to find, and we love hearing from our listeners. So,
especially if they're amateurs, you like to you argue with amateurs too. So that's always good news.
Thank you very much for those kind words. I don't know that I deserve that much praise. How are you doing on the on Bryce Takes the Bar exam? What's your total so far?
Absolutely horrible. Oh. I don't share my
okay. All right, sorry. I didn't
with anybody because I'm ashamed.
Oh.
I know that Thomas is still in the running for it, but I'm not going to get hired at the law firm.
Oh.
Of the
hey, we've got 200 questions to go. So you might go on a winning streak for a while, but
we'll see. It's got to be a serious winning streak to pull me out of the hole I'm in. But of course, everything for that will be in the show notes. You can check there for links. And if you are a Patreon subscriber, please listen to the Patreon edition of this episode, because we're about to turn off the record button and just hit a quick record segment for just the patrons only, talking about the parallels between, well, Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump. I try and keep this show as apolitical as possible to a certain extent. And, for Patreon subscribers, you get a little extra snippet. So, yeah, Andrew, let's go on and let's go talk about Jackson and Trump, because I'm finding some of the parallels are absolutely disturbing. But for now, of course, once again, Andrew, thank you for your kind words and thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that was my discussion with Andrew Torrez of Opening Arguments Podcast. Be sure to check the show notes for a link to his amazing show. And of course, I want to thank him again for coming on to help us deconstruct this Mormon extermination order. It should be noted that this law was on the books until 1976, when Governor at the time, Kit Bond, realized it was completely fucked up and rescinded it at the request of an RLDS state president named Lyman Edwards. Here's the text of the 1976 order rescinding the Mormon extermination order. And I think it perfectly captures how the original Mormon extermination order violated constitutional rights from the beginning. This is the entirety of his order. Quote, whereas on October 27, 1838, the governor of the state of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs, signed an order calling for the extermination or expulsion of the Mormons from the state of Missouri, and whereas Governor Boggs' order clearly contravened the rights to life, liberty, property, and religious freedom as guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States, as well as the Constitution of the state of Missouri. And whereas, in this bicentennial year, as we reflect on our nation's heritage, the exercise of religious freedom is without question one of the basic tenets of our free democratic republic. Now, therefore, I, Christopher S. Bond, Governor of the state of Missouri, by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Constitution and the laws of the state of Missouri, do hereby order as follows, expressing on behalf of all Missourians our deep regret for the injustice and undue suffering which was caused by the 1838 order, I hereby rescind Executive Order Number 44, dated October 27, 1838, issued by Governor W. Boggs. In witness, I have hereunto set my hand and caused to be affixed the great seal of the state of Missouri in the city of Jefferson on this 25th day of June, 1976. Signed, Christopher S. Bond, Governor. 1976 was when the Mormon extermination order was taken off the books. Of course, the extermination order didn't have any real teeth once the Mormon conflict de-escalated, by the middle of 1839. So this rescission was completely ceremonial in 1976. And Andrew and I only read the first part of the order because That was the legal part, which was relevant to his expertise and why I invited him on in the first place. And that was the part with the actual operating clause that Governor Kit Bond had to rescind the order from. But the rest of the Mormon extermination order contains details which are incredibly relevant to the historical timeline, and it'll be where we have to end our discussion for today. This is the rest of the Mormon extermination order that Andrew and I did not read. Quote, "The Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace. Their outrages are beyond all description." That's where we ended our discussion. This is where we're picking up. "If you can increase your force, you are authorized to do so to any extent you may consider necessary. I have just issued orders to Major General Willock of Marion County to raise 500 men and to march them to the northern part of Daviess and there unite with General Donovan of Clay, who's been ordered with 500 men to proceed to the same point for the purpose of intercepting the retreat of the Mormons to the north. They have been directed to communicate with you by express. You can also communicate with them if you find it necessary. Instead, therefore, of proceeding as at first directed to reinstate the citizens of Daviess in their homes, you will proceed immediately to Richmond and then operate against the Mormons. Brigadier General Parks of Ray has been ordered to have 400 of his brigade in readiness to join you at Richmond. The whole force will be placed under your command. I am very respectfully your obedient servant, Lilburn W. Boggs, Commander-in-Chief." End quote. Now, he's writing this whole order to General John Clark, who we introduced at the beginning. He gathered this entire militia. This order of October 26th ordered this massive militia to gather 3,500 men strong. And then the order of the 27th said, "Oh, turns out the Mormons are in open defiance of the law, and we need to treat them like this is a war." So all of those 3,500 men, I also called out another 500 from General Willock of Marion County, and all 4,000 of those men are placed under your command, General Clark. Now, this is important because it gives us insight into the military strategy, which plays out over the next 3 days. And it also included a pretty brash fuck you from Boggs to General Atrocity, who was still commanding his militia in Clay County in attempt to intervene wherever would hopefully cool off the situation. In the second half of that order from Boggs, there wasn't a command given to Major General Atrocity, who responded as any commanding officer in the field should when relieved of command. Atrocity went home to Liberty and disbanded his militia. This was the worst possible thing to happen for the Mormons. One of the few non-Mormon allies who understood the situation arguably better than anybody else and actually held sway with Governor Boggs, washed his hands of the situation, probably knowing full well that things would spiral out of control in his absence. Now, even some of the local newspapers were baffled at his relief of command. No other general in this conflict could properly take his place, nor did the Mormons trust any single person in Missouri government more than they trusted General Atrocity, and they just lost their most powerful ally when they needed him the most. General John B. Clark was promoted to the highest-ranking field officer in the conflict, a man who'd historically been quite unfriendly to the Mormons, and he became the commanding officer for Generals Donovan and Parks, the only other two Mormon allies in the conflict. He sent a letter to General Atrocity asking for his continued presence in the conflict. General Clark realized how much of an asset General Atrocity was, and he couldn't figure out why Boggs had relieved him, but he just told Atrocity to, act in any way that he saw as beneficial. But, General Clark was the new highest ranking general in the field. What he said went. He was head honcho of all of this massive military that was gathered in response to Mormons. But that also meant that he was the commanding officer for Colonel Neil Gilliam, General Lucas, Captain Bogart, Colonel Thomas Jennings, Colonel William Peniston, and all of these other men who were primary enemies of the church throughout this entire conflict. They were rallying local mobs and marching around as vigilante militias before this. These men had been answering the Mormon depredations with depredations of their own against the Mormons, and now all of them were unified under Brigadier General John Bullock Clark, armed with an executive order to do whatever they felt necessary to remove or exterminate the Mormons from Missouri. Now, I hope we can all understand there's no turning back after this. Boggs must have known as soon as he put his seal on the extermination order that people would die because of it. The people wouldn't die from starvation and exposure as had been happening up to this point, but by violent military attacks. The only expected conclusion once things escalate beyond a certain threshold is military violence. And I think we crossed that threshold back in August of 1838 with the Gallatin Election Day battle. Now, you probably have your own opinions about when this situation went officially out of control, but this is the tailspin right before impact. With his newly acquired military power, General Clark expressed orders to the relevant field officers, concentrating every single available platoon to the twin Mormon sanctuary cities, Far West and Diahman. Amid circulating rumors that the Mormons were setting up to defile Livingston or Clinton counties next, General Lucas's troops were the first to arrive within visible range for the Mormon scouts around Far West. This is taken from page 159 of the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri by Stephen LeSueur, describing what happened when Lucas's army came within sight range of the Mormons. Quote, "While Hinkle's company was searching for the Missouri troops, those troops marched to Far West by a different route. The Mormons at Far West spotted the Missouri army about an hour before sunset as the army crossed a small creek 2 miles south of town. One of the Mormon guards called for his company to retreat as the large army approached. 'Retreat? Where in the name of God shall we retreat to?' exclaimed Joseph Smith, who quickly led 300 soldiers to the edge of Far West and formed a battle line. As the Missourians approached to within a mile of town, Hinkle returned with his company of soldiers. Lucas dispatched Donovan with 250 men to intercept Hinkle's company, but the Mormons eluded their pursuers and galloped safely into Far West, where they joined the other soldiers in line. Seeing the Mormons intended to stand, Lucas decided to postpone the attack and wait for reinforcements. He withdrew his troops and camped about 1.5 miles south of Far West." End quote. So General Clark, the general that was overseeing this entire military operation, was en route and would arrive within a couple of days. But we need to keep our eye on that Colonel Thomas Jennings. As General Lucas and his army were beginning their siege of Far West in the afternoon of October 30th, Colonel Jennings was in the middle of marching his troop of 250 men a few miles east of Far West towards Haun's Mill. God help the Mormons. And that is it for the historical portion of today's episode.
It's time for Mormon Mimsies.
If I show you something, promise you won't tell?
Like a secret? Really? Cool.
All right, it is time. We get into the Mormon Mimsy for this week. So we had last week's was this quote. Joseph then went to Palmyra and, said he, I there met that damn fool Martin Harris and told him I command to ask the first honest man I met with for $50 in money and he would let me have it. I saw at once, said Joe, that it took his notion, for he promptly gave me the 50, end quote. Now, the Mormon Mimsy, we got to figure out where these came from. And this, amazingly, within about 45 minutes of the episode airing, we had listener Julianne Briscoe, also known as the real Emma Hale, write in on Twitter saying that is the Peter Ingersoll affidavit from December 2nd, 1833, first published in Eberhau's Mormonism Unveiled. Ding, ding, ding. There's our winner for Mormon Mimsy, the first ever Mormon Mimsy. So, I didn't expect it to be quite that easy, but apparently she recognized some of the terminology that was used there, the damn fool Martin Harris. That's pretty hard to forget once you read it out of Mormonism Unveiled. So, of course, thank you to Julianne for getting that in. And she is our winner for this week's Mormon Mimsy. So let's get another quote out there and float it, and let's see what you guys think. Let's see. I realized, 45 minutes after it aired, she got this. We got to make these a little bit harder to find. So here is a quote that I'm going to give out there, and let's see how long it takes somebody to find it, because it's really interesting. And it talks about the what was going on the Morley family ranch, the Isaac Morley farm. Quote, I believe I was the first person with a young man whose name I have forgotten, who was present when they took what was called the sacrament up at the Morley house. They were in the habit of turning everybody out of the door when they partook of the bread and wine, putting up blankets at the windows, shutting off the sight from without, and making it darker within, obviously. They started a regular powwow, and when they got well going, then they opened the door and let us all come in again. A young man and myself made it up that we would stay in unless they took us out by force. So this person who's giving the quote said, we're going to go see what those sacrament ceremonies are on the Morley farm. Let's see what's going on. The young man got asleep, and I had the dumb evil and could not talk. So the person who's giving the quote brought with him somebody that fell asleep when they started drinking the wine, and he said that he had the dumb evil and somehow couldn't talk. That's some powerful wine. But they did not carry us out, but went on with the sacrament. The poorhouse in Portage County, Ohio, where there were half a dozen insane and idiotic persons, was the best comparison of anything to the scene that night. That's amazing. So he said essentially the homeless shelter is the best analog to describe what was going on here. And he said, and if I had my cloak on, I would have stolen the wine and carried it home to see whether it was drugged or not. End quote. Tell us, where does this quote come from? Or is it even a real quote? Who knows? Maybe it's not even a real quote. So if you want to jump on Facebook or Twitter and play Mormon Mimsy with the Naked Mormonism profile, be sure to hashtag it Mormon Mimsy or M-Mimsy so we know who is playing and we can look it up later and, see who was able to take this. And, Facebook is a great way to do it as well. Find the post for this episode and comment on the show notes there. I would love to play some Mormon Mimsy with you guys. Is this a real quote? If so, where did it come from? Or is it just a complete fabrication? We're going to round number 2 of Mormon Mimsy. Let's see who pulls this one out. All right, we have a few new patrons to thank. People have been just amazingly generous. We have, John, David, Al, Roger, Pamela, Vinny, Rick, Anthony, Aaron, Stephen, and Kelsey, Chingai. Guy, something like that. Goran, and wow, I didn't even see this. We have a new Nemo demon here, Lynn Blanche. So all of the new people are patrons, and then especially to Lynn Blanche. Thank you all very much for supporting the show and for continuing support. It's turned this into a full-time endeavor and allowed for this investigative journalism to get out there, and makes it so I can pour hours a week into researching this show and getting it out there for you guys. So as an expression of my gratitude for all of the financial support that all of the amazing patrons offer, you guys are truly the best. Just thank you all so much for what you do. All right, and as stated at the beginning of the episode, please, if you have the time or ability to do so, go on to Main Street Plaza and vote for the 2016 Brody Awards. We'd really like to take some of those home for 2016 as well as 2015, maybe keep a run going here. So, I really do appreciate that for any of you who do vote. You can also check the Facebook and Twitter page if you want to find links there for it. We'll have separate posts up for for Main Street Plaza for the Brody Awards. So to those who do vote in advance, thank you so much. You help get the word out there for the show. All right, I think that is everything for this week's episode. If you are a patron supporter, you probably heard this earlier in the interview with Andrew, please listen to the Patreon-only edition of this episode. You're going to hear an extra, 30 minutes of conversation where Andrew and I talk about the parallels between Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump. You know, I keep this show apolitical for a reason, because I am very ignorant when it comes to politics. I only know just a little bit of that I've been exposed to it. But for when I do have somebody on that knows an incredible amount about politics and law, we can't help but jump into the discussion a little bit. So, be sure to check out the Patreon-only edition of this episode to get that extra bit of content. It's really worth it, especially this time, I promise. Just a little heads up, next episode is going to be a little bit different. We had Christopher Smith on for last week's episode discussing, a great deal number of things throughout Mormon history. I mean, any time that a Mormon historian is on, we really got to put him through the ringer, see what comes out. But apparently Chris takes a little issue with the word genocide when it comes to Brigham Young. And I think that is, personally, in my opinion, a great word to describe what was done at the hands of Brigham Young. So he's going to come on and, for 2 guest episodes in a row, Chris Smith is going to come on and we're going to discuss whether or not what Brigham Young did was actually genocide, or if a slightly less abrasive word like conquest is a better word for it. But, it's going to be an open discussion, not a debate, dependent on if Chris makes, sound enough arguments to me. I'll be happy to change the title of the episode, because I think that's where he took issue with it, calling it Bloody Brigham's Genocide. He disagrees with that vehemently. So if we can come to some sort of understanding, if he can convince me that it wasn't a genocide, I'm going to change the name of the episode, but until that point, it's very hard to do so. So I really look forward to having Chris on again next week, and we're going to jump into a discussion, and hopefully you guys enjoy that as much as I enjoy having the conversation with him. Also, if you are a patron subscriber and do support the show through patreon.com, be sure to keep an eye on your inbox through the account that you use to support it. You'll be receiving an email on Monday, February 6th for our NAMO home evening, our first ever NAMO home evening. And of course, it's only thanks to the patrons themselves who have made that a possibility even in the first place. So, of course, be keeping an eye out. We're going to do a Google Hangouts, and Marie Kent from the My Book of Mormon podcast, my co-host over there, is going to be joining us as well for this Google Hangouts. Who knows how it'll go? This is a first-time run. We're going to give it a shot, the old college try, and just kind of go from there. So, if you're a patron supporter, you are invited to join us in this Google Hangouts, and I really look forward to talking to you there. But that's everything for this week's episode. Of course, I need to shut her down by thanking a few people and then calling it a night. First off, I need to thank Demonista for running the Facebook page. Thank you very much for doing that. Also need to thank Julie, or The Real Emma Hale, for running the Twitter handle. Thank you for doing that. Need to thank Craig Keeling for providing the artwork that's used in the show. Go to weirdmormonshit.com to see his blog. I need to thank Jason Camo for providing the music used in the show with his permission. Go to aloststateofmind.com to listen to all of his amazing music there. Need to thank all of the patrons who support the show at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. And if you're awesome enough to sign up and count yourself among the ranks of the supporters of the show, you gain access to special edition episodes and content that regular listeners do not gain access to. So be sure to do that. I also need to thank Andrew Torrez once again for coming onto the show this week, as well as for being the legal counsel for the show. And if you'd like to leave a voicemail talking about the show, or talking about your story, or corrections that you have to offer, you can do so by dialing 864-NAKED-MO, 864-625-3366. It goes straight to voicemail and will be played in the next episode there. And of course, before shutting it all down, I need to thank all of the listeners out there for lending me your ear. I hope to talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. I'm not sure why I waited until after the episode's over to include this, but so many people sent in birthday wishes, and I want to thank all of you for doing that. I didn't realize how loving and open and beautiful this community is until I opened up my Facebook on the morning of my birthday and just saw all of these comments. Happy birthday, enjoy another circling of the sun, and all of these just super positive and generous well wishes for the birthday. I mean, I cannot thank you enough. It really makes me feel included, and like I'm actually talking to friends, not just talking through a digital veil, and not just talking to a microphone. I'm talking to people that I consider my friends. So to all of my friends out there, whether you wrote in birthday wishes or not, I consider you all my friends. Just thank you for being who you are. Thank you. Thank you. The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, all rights reserved.